First of all, a big welcome back to our listeners and viewers of the Responsible Edge podcast, brought to you by the Andrew Greenwash Charter. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Cédric. Cédric, thank you so much for giving up some of your time this morning to join us for an episode.
No, thank you so much, Ollie, for having me. It's a delight to be on here. I've been listening to your podcast for a while, so super excited.
Oh, Cédric, you are the dream guest. You're already plugging away the fact that we've been listening to the show beforehand. That's fantastic to hear. Now, Cédric, I know that you've also, you've hot-footed it across to another apartment in the building because of some drainage issues. So I have to say, I'm absolutely all about the commitment that you're showing to join us for a show today. It's great to see. Cédric, we've got 20 minutes or so to introduce our listeners that aren't aware of you and your work, to give them a real flavour of you and your background. And as per the show's kind of format and structure, we're really keen to understand the role that kind of corporate ethics, responsibility, and sustainability has played in inspiring you to do what you've done so far in your career and what your kind of ambitions and intentions are for the rest of your career. So as you've listened to the show, some people start at the very, very, very beginning, and others perhaps a little later into kind of higher education or their professional, early parts of their professional career. Start wherever you like, take over and give us a flavour of you.
Sure. Yeah. So I'll give a very quick on the further back bit that I've sort of always been very interested in finance, and that sort of led me to study business and then economics and finance in my uni level. So I did a bachelor and then a master's. For my master's, I moved to Australia to do that, and that was lovely. It was sunny and nice, and I could wakeboard on the weekends. So that's made me very happy.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt already. I have to say, for those listeners, that when Cédric and I first met, he was camping out in Colombia. And now he's just mentioned that he manages to do his master's in Australia. This man is clearly got a real ability for finding and seeking the sun. So, yeah, Cédric, sorry, carry on. And sorry, actually, before carrying on, I want to ask you, you mentioned you were always interested in finance. What was it that interested you in finance?
I don't really know actually why I was always interested, but I remember like very early days talking to my dad about it and like investments and finance and how the economy works at large. I don't really believe in that we become our parents, but my dad is very into economics, so maybe he inspired me, but I don't know. To be honest, it was just something that I picked up along the way.
Interesting. You had that curious mind for how does this big system work that affects everything, but I want to understand more about it. Sorry, I interrupted you though. You're in Australia, you're enjoying the warmer climes, and you're doing your master's.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm doing my master's in economics and finance, and really finding it very useful and interesting. It's really hard to get a visa to stay in Australia. So once I graduated, I started looking elsewhere and got a job in London, or actually outside of London in a small place called Reigate down in Surrey. But for someone not living in UK, that was essentially London. And a few months later, I actually moved into London. But and that was sort of my first introduction to finance. And I worked for what I today would sort of call like big evil corporations in very traditional finance roles, finding that super interesting. But as I sort of met people throughout life, just, going out and having a drink or in activities or whatever, you realize that people have quite different backgrounds and history, and that maybe the world we're living in is not as fair and equal as one would like. I mean, and also I think, so we're now around 2015, and sort of climate change and environmental things are coming more on the agenda. And I sort of start realizing that there's an incredible force in finance and the amount of money that it controls and the amount of capital that you can move and how it impacts governments and corporations, but also individual people's life. And that is probably not done in the most fair and equal way, to put it lightly. And that maybe I should try and pivot my career a little bit more to work with that. Mm-hmm. So at this point, I'm working for what's called an asset manager. So this is sort of the ones who manage your pensions, or if you save in an ISA account or similar, you would put them into a fund, and we would be managing those monies. And I started trying to always get involved in anything we did that was about responsible finance and sustainable investing. And this was a trend that was really picking up, luckily for me, in a professional manner, around that time. So I started not officially working with it, but being involved in various projects in those areas.
And so before we go on, by the way, you're positioning this perfectly and giving us the perfect amount of detail on this, which is fantastic. You mentioned that sort of pre-2015, there was sort of these moments of inspiration, if you like, when you were meeting people, engaging with people that were sort of highlighting, if you like, the inequality. Can you play within the economy, etc.? Can you highlight any particular examples for us of that?
I mean, I think one, like actually on on an individual level, is that studying in Australia costs a lot of money. So I'm coming from Sweden originally, and university there is free. And all of a sudden I had to pay for university, and luckily I come from a rich country and I could afford to do that, and I had the privilege of use my money to buy myself happiness and move to a place that was warm and have a good education. And I saw some of my fellow students who managed to do that, but realizing that the cost for them was many, many, many times higher than it was for me, because of their backgrounds and where they were from, or they were there on scholarships. And then you get a lot of stress about your grades and that sort of thing. And I think I don't really have a good sort of like light bulb moment. I think it was more like slowly creeping in as you meet people, and they tell you the stories about where they grew up or what they did when they were kids, or when whatever happened in their life, and you realize that, like, oh wow, that was 10 years later than it happened to me. So it's just small things like that sort of slowly creeped up.
A building of evidence, if you like, for you to go, wow, look at the way that the world actually works, and then thinking about how your piece of the world, if you like, that you're there able to affect, how that can be used as you described, as a force for change. Out of interest, around that time of 2015, when you're having this sort of, this real sort of pivoting, if you like, in your career, like how prevalent at that stage is the notion of responsible, sustainable finance? Was it already well established, or was it something that you were very much there at the beginning of, if you like?
Yeah, no, it was very at the start. So sustainable finance, I would say, like, my first true interaction with it was maybe 2017, and it was in a very, very simplified manner where this is like a very clear memory in my head. Is a portfolio manager coming over, and he was just launching our first sustainable product, and asked, "Oh, what does that mean?" And he's like, "Oh, by just tweaking a little bit in the edges, we can have half the carbon emission in this portfolio compared to our standard portfolio, and it doesn't impact anything. We essentially sold 2 companies." And he sort of just admitted, quite simply saying that if you remove the coal companies, you reduce your carbon emission. But at that stage, it was nothing about, does that actually change real life outcomes, right? It changes the report you give to your client. And it was not about questioning, is the data integrity strong? Like, do we actually know how much these companies are emitting? Do we need to look at other things than emissions? And that's what, like, there was a lot of things that were not there. It was the very, very simplistic way of looking at it. That I think today we've gotten a lot further. But I do remember that conversation quite strongly in my head, and being like, oh, but if it's so easy, why are we not doing it?
The key question. It sounds so, you're right, it sounds so primitive, compared to where things are at today. I interrupt you there, Cédric. Okay, so we're sort of in the 2017 areas now. You're working with this asset manager. What happens next?
Yeah, so I get more and more involved with sustainability, but it's sort of not my daytime job. It's more a little bit on the side project here and there. And then COVID comes, and I for some still don't really understand why, but I decided to move back to Sweden. And I'm a person who likes big cities, so moving back to Sweden was maybe not the wisest choice in hindsight. But while I do that, I sort of get in contact with a company called Matter, where I'm working today, and we are a sustainability data provider. So essentially what we do is that we look at companies and we say, these are the data points we have around you, from carbon emissions to gender pay gaps, to how do you impact nature, do you contribute to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and so on. And that's really when I start working full-time with sustainability, and where I truly start dedicating myself and get into the weeds about it. And since then, I've left Sweden and moved back to London and sort of running our London office for Matter now, which is really exciting. We're a very small team here and a small company, so it fits me well to work in a small group. And we're very much an ethos-driven company where we want to make the world better rather than just earn a lot of money, and that's also nice.
And talk to me about. I mean, I'm going to put words in your mouth here, so feel free to tell me that, Charlie, that's absolutely not the case. But when you know, a normal person sort of looks at people that work in finance, like there's that immediate association with, you know, you work in finance, you work with money. It's all about there's a greed, there's a maximization of return. There's all of these perhaps archaic views, I think, of the finance industry as a whole. For you, going through that kind of pivot point in 2015 and then ultimately working on projects, but then ultimately joining Matter, and sort of, as far as I'm aware of sort of the work you do at Matter, obviously you work and support these asset managers, these financial institutions, etc. But you're not directly involved, if you like, in the redistribution or the investment side of the money itself. If I've understood you correctly, feel free to tell me if I've not. How does that sit with you personally in terms of the way that you view yourself and the way that you view your career now that you're working on that side, if you like?
This is such a good question. So I'll give you a personal answer and a professional answer. Mm-hmm. So my wife has a background from sort of public housing and worked in the public sector for a long time. And she had exactly that view of finance people as you described, and could not stand them. And somehow I was the exception, and I managed to convince her. So I fully see why that is the view. I mean, especially for my generation who's grown up during the financial crisis, or rather came to sort of job market around financial crisis, and the finance world blew everything up, to put it mildly. I think there is a deserved reputation, but I think there's another way to see it, and which is maybe where my professional view comes in, is that whether we like it or not, the finance industry has a lot of power. And we can either try and burn down the house, or we can try and change it from the inside. And I think both these strategies are valid in different times, but I think when it comes to the finance industry, I'd rather change it from the inside, and make sure that we use that capital for good than for evil. The world is not always easy to split in evil and good, but in broad strokes. So I think the way I see it is that we can enable investors, asset managers, to allocate money to things that are better. And on the margin, we will help them. And what we try and do different than our competitors is that we really, and that's why I think we like your podcast, is that we're really against greenwashing. So we take a very, very conservative approach to what is sustainable, and how do we be honest about what we measure and what we can promise. And we can't always, I think that's an issue that the sustainable finance industry has right now, that they're sort of over-promising, similar to that portfolio managers, that like, I'll sell 2 companies and I halve my emissions. But it's no discussion about, did you change something in the real world? Or did you just change something in a report to your clients? And I think that's where we come in, and we try to be very careful in what we promise and what we say and how we state things, to be quite cautious about the impact it has in the real world, but also the promising that something is sustainable when it's maybe just better. Maybe it's not fully sustainable, but it's one step in the right direction.
Progress over perfection, indeed. And Cédric, tell me since you started working in the, and I'm going to use massive generalizations here, so feel free to target it a bit more, but since you started working in finance, you mentioned that, you know, the attitude that you've evolved personally and developed over that time and your areas of focus. How do you think that the whole industry has shifted in terms of its collective mindset? Have we still got a lot of the, I'm going to use your terminology, a lot of the evil agents, if you like, out there, or are we sort of collectively shifting away from that? What's your take?
Yeah, and let me just correct myself that I don't think individuals tend to be evil, but I think it's sort of a culture that fosters incorrect incentives.
Yes,
rather, and I use, but you're fully right. I use that word maybe a bit too lightly sometimes. I don't know if I've cursed yet in this podcast, but I'm sure there'll be a few curse words coming as well.
Feel free. We want clear communication. If you need to, don't worry. Go on.
But to answer your question, I think it's a very regional split. So I think in Europe we're seeing a lot of progress, and I don't think there's any large asset manager that don't take this topic seriously today. It's top of the agenda across the organization in Europe. There might be some smaller shops where it's, you know, it's they're stuck in the same mindset, but at large this has really shifted in the industry in Europe. Asia and Pacific, we're seeing movement, but not consistently across the sector. But we're seeing some organization trying to differentiate themselves and trying to make this their unique selling point. Japan is very on the forefront when it comes to nature specifically. So not so much on climate or social, but nature is very, very important there. And then if we're looking at North America, I mean, I don't need to say much right now about that, I think, because I think anyone listening to this podcast is slightly up to date with the news and would know that there's quite a bit backlash there. But we're starting to also see an anti-ESG movement as well, where some of the democratic states are pushing back and doubling down their efforts as an answer. So it's quite a fragmented situation, but it is right now. It's very much up in the air what's happening in the US for the industry.
And Cédric, that was brilliant. I love how you provided us with a regional take on it, and not taken just huge generalizations as I tend to do poorly. But how does the US? You mentioned the US, the situation, if we want to call it that, in the US currently. I should say that this podcast has been recorded on the 27th of February for those that are sort of interested in the context in which Cédric and I are talking this through. How do you feel about what's going on over there as somebody who has committed their career to trying to work on influencing, as you alluded to before, the finance world in a positive way? How does it make you feel?
I think it's hard to know yet, to be honest. The strategy of the current administration is very much to overcrowd the media space. So they're throwing out everything out there, and that includes sustainable finance, but also in other areas. And we don't really know what's going to stick. Everything is being challenged in courts, etc. And I heard a recommendation that the way to deal with the news right now is to actually wait 10 days and then listen to it, because then you kind of have an idea of did the court uphold it and so on. And I think in that whole, like, that's true in sustainable finance as well, where we've seen a lot of the asset managers, a lot of the banks sort of withdraw from Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance and Net Zero Asset Manager Alliance, which is two industry-wide groups to combat climate change. But we're still seeing them doing the work. They just cannot be as public about it. But when you talk to people further down in the organization, they still have a buy-in. They're still doing things. They might phrase it slightly differently, but they're walking the walk still. So it is a little bit unknown, I would say, to where we're going. And we need to remember it's only been a month in the current administration, and the first month of any administration is sort of when they do a lot of things, and then half of them get stuck in courts and half of them they forget, and then we see what's sort of left. So it's quite hard to know.
Cédric, that was so brilliantly placed, and I it's so wild to think it's only been a month. I mean, I'm not gonna be able to keep up if it's as you. Hopefully, things sort of quieten down as you say, because there's just so much to contend with. Let me ask you this: I could keep you've got such an interesting way of responding to these questions. I could keep asking about you all day, Cédric. But last kind of couple of questions on you. When you think about the kind of rest of your career and you think about, what you would like to, the impact that you would like to be able to have, if you get to the end of your career and you were looking back at it, what do you want to be able to say about what you did?
Yeah, I think something I'm battling with now, which I've alluded to a few times, is sort of how do we prove that the things in finance actually impact the real world.
Mm-hmm.
So it's all well and good if a few of our clients sell oil companies, but does that mean that less oil is extracted?
Mm-hmm.
And that link is quite hard to prove, and it's quite difficult to discern the sort of cause and effect here. I think I would like to do more around that, and sort of towards my end of my career come back and being like, yes, I was a cog in a very big machine that sort of did that change. And I'm scratching my head a lot around that at the moment. And I think it's a debate since I started my professional career. Has been a debate of like, is there even something like sustainable finance? Because does it even have an impact? And I think the answer is always complex, and that there's an impact. It's just hard to prove when and where and how. But there's definitely an impact, and I think we're seeing it around the world, because if there weren't an impact, we wouldn't have all the inequalities on the other side in that unsustainable finance world, which they have created. So I definitely think there's something there. So yeah, I think what I would.
Sorry to just interrupt you on that point. But and I know it's a complex thing to answer, but again, from a layman's terms perspective, is it simply that our reporting and our utilization of data is the thing that is going to get us from where we are right now, where we have to infer impact, to actually being able to turn around and go, no, you can see that sustainable finance has led to X? Is it as simple as we just need better data, better reporting?
I think it's one puzzle piece.
Okay.
So I think right now we only have somewhere a few thousand companies that report their emissions. And to put that in perspective, our sort of total universe is 60,000 companies. So it means we have somewhere around 55,000 companies maybe who don't report their emissions.
It's crazy.
So if they don't even report their emissions, like how are we going to know if we have an impact? So I think it's sort of one step in the direction, but then I think there's also the data enables academia to prove these things. So there's a few professors who work quite hard on this, and there's one paper out that's looking, for example, of if an investor engage with a company to say you should set a science-based target, which is a very formal process to commit to reducing your emissions. Are they more likely to do it than another company? And essentially found out that yes, they are. They are about 50% more likely to do that. And it's one piece of a big puzzle. It doesn't mean that all sustainable finance work, but it means that one certain thing works. And the only reason we know that is because that professor had data to look at it. So I think it is a complex ecosystem, and we need to work together to get there, essentially.
Well, that was a brilliant response. And Cédric, I think before I go off on a massive tangent and start asking you for us to investigate or interrogate all the other factors that might influence that, we're going to get you back on, if you want to, for another show where we can talk about those details in a bit more depth. Let's move forward though now. Notice how I didn't get you to confirm either way. Hopefully we will get a confirmation at the end. Let's move forward now and introduce, if possible, the article in The Guardian from January this year, 25. Would you mind just providing just a brief overview and summary for our listeners of what the piece covered? And then just pick out for me, what was the most interesting or, disagreeable point perhaps from the piece for you?
Yeah, so the article talks about how the richer nations is essentially extracting wealth from the poorer nations. And it's done in a few different ways, be that sort of owning corporations that operate there under very preferable terms, or through finance flows. And this is obviously an issue when we're trying to I don't like this term, so I'll use it once, but I'll try and avoid it. But we're trying to help nations to develop. And the reason I dislike this, because I think words matter, and anyone who's been across the world knows that each country has developed. We are a developed world. What we're actually saying is that we want to make them rich, and that's a different thing, I think. But when we're trying to make countries rich, we cannot sit here in Europe or in US or in East Asia and take that wealth, be that through running corporations on very favorable terms with very low cost of labor, or which I'm maybe more interested in, what maybe is more interesting for this conversation, is sort of extracting high interest rates from those countries when they borrow money, and then transferring that to what's actually our pensions usually, or our wealth funds in the case of Norway, for example. It's sort of not a fair playing ground, and that makes we're just sort of continue in the same little hamster wheel over and over again, because we're not giving the tools and the possibility for countries to become rich.
And Cédric, and I'm going to come back, that was brilliantly summarized. And for our listeners and viewers that would like to check out the article, we'll obviously link to it in all of our materials. But Cédric's nailed it in terms of introducing the key themes in it. Let me ask, I think the article suggested that, I might be getting this wrong, but was it in 2023, it was $1.4 trillion that was repaid, or debt repayment from the poorer nations to richer nations, if I got that right. That number, I mean, I have to be honest, when we get into finance numbers, as soon as it gets into billions and trillions, etc., it's so hard for somebody like me to kind of conceive. But as soon as you stick a trillion on it, it just is obviously a huge, huge number. How many people do you think, you mentioned pensions, etc., how many people do you think are aware of this? Like, do you think it's something that just general awareness is just so poor on the impact of this? Or is this something that, in your experience, people are aware of?
I think, I 1.4 trillion is a huge number, even in finance terms, right? So it's enormous. And I think I think the awareness question is interesting, because I think it depends on what we're asking. It depends on what aware means, right? So if I ask an ex-colleague of mine, they'd be like, yeah, of course, if I lend to a country in South America, I'm going to get 5 to 10% higher return, or interest rate, rather, not necessarily return, but interest rate, than if I would lend to a European country.
Mm-hmm.
They know that. That's just a matter of fact. I don't think they then think about the consequences of that. And I think that's what I find interesting, is because when you and I take out a mortgage here in UK, our mortgage rate is linked to the Bank of England's interest rate. So if Bank of England increase or decrease their interest rate, our mortgage goes up and down. And that's quite an important thing to consider, because that means that when a country has a higher interest rate, that also means that the mortgages will be more expensive, the car loan will be more expensive, the corporate loan will be more expensive. So it means that it's not just that the government is paying more, it's every individual and every organization in that country, because it's so intrinsically linked. And I think that piece of the puzzle is probably not something that's that most people are aware of, and even in sustainable finance, I think it's a bit of a miss, because we often look at corporates rather than governments, because it's a bit harder to influence a government without getting into politics.
And Cédric, it's really interesting, because you clearly, when we were talking about you were talking about the attraction of joining Matter was about sort of understanding or working towards a real appreciation of the real world impact of the work that's done within the finance world. Well, what you've just described, that is the real world impact that people aren't aware of, is that by operating or engaging with poorer countries around the world in this way, the richer countries are essentially creating these real world outcomes for people that are living in these countries. It is more costly to afford to buy a home. It is more costly to realize any finance or opportunity, therefore, in them helping to develop whatever aspect of their lives they're interested in. What's your take on? There seems to this is I have to admit, and I'm going to be the first one to swear here, Cédric. It's really pissed me off learning about this on the show, because there's clear just hypocrisy at play in so much of this. You mentioned before, finance is such a massive, influencing factor, driving factor in enacting change, and there's so much, noise around, aid and support and ways that countries around the world, richer countries, are supporting poorer ones. But this is so evidently the sort of stem of the problem. Just touch on that for me. Do you agree? Is there just this hypocrisy at play in the world?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's so multifaceted. So if you come from a very traditional finance view, you early on in the university learned that there's something called the risk-free rate, which is essentially the rate of return you can get without any risk, and that would be what the central bank says. So they say, lend us your money and there's no risk. We promise to pay them back and we'll give you 5% or 3% or 2% or whatever. That risk-free rate has been 0% in Europe since financial crisis. So it means that the financing in Europe has been free, more or less, for 2 decades. 1 decade. And that's obviously very, very beneficial for be an individual or a corporate or a government. But weirdly enough, the risk-free rate in a place like Colombia is probably 7, 8, 9%. And it's weird how we doesn't actually consider that a risk-free rate, because we would say actually the government of Colombia is not risk-free, because you have a currency risk and you have this risk and that political risk and so on. But as we saw in 2016 in Europe, we have a currency and political risk in Europe when most of the Mediterranean countries came into a financial crisis again. We had a euro crisis. We'll talk about Greece leaving EU, or at least the euro, and so on. So it's not that we don't have those risks here as well. It's just that us sitting in a rich country, we view it very, very differently, because we say, oh, that's where we have control over that. We're developed, so we know how to manage those risks. And you guys over there, you don't know how to manage that. And it's a bizarre thing, right?
It's pure arrogance. It's pure arrogance, and it's arrogance based upon, as you've quite rightly just highlighted, the evidence of malpractice and sort of the inability to manage things effectively, which over the course of the last 10, 15, 20 years. Sorry, Cédric, you're getting me riled up here. How is this addressed? Like how? And again, I know it's the $64 billion or perhaps $1 trillion question, but how is this addressed? How do we move forward?
Yes, I mean, right now the way it's addressed is very much through multi-country organizations such as like IMF and World Bank. They tend to, or through aid organizations, and they tend to go out and say, we guarantee half of this loan and you take only risk with half of the loan. And that way you get down interest rates. The problem with that is that when you talk to people who actually live in a poorer country or middle income country, because let's be frank, a lot of these countries are quite wealthy. They hate those organizations. They laugh at them. They're saying they're completely useless. I was at a seminar at a conference in last autumn, and the discussion was about, okay, how do we work with emerging markets and make sure that capital is allocated to emerging markets? And that's another term I hate, and I can come back to why. But and everyone in that seminar who was working in one of the countries in question were like saying, like, we don't need more World Bank, we don't need more IMF. We need good financial systems that treats us on equal terms. we don't need you to come and guarantee 50% of our loans, because what they do is they say, we guarantee 50% of the loan, but also here's a list of things you need to do. Right? And they say like, but we know what we want to do. You don't know what we want to do. So it becomes another another way that we are oppressing a country. And that's not what we need more of, but that's how it's done today.
And you've alluded to it there, like what does a global sort of trade and finance system that is equitable, what are the characteristics of that system?
I mean, I think there's a few aspects of it, right? So one of them is, I think right now the finance world operates in 3 categories, which is developed markets, emerging markets, and frontier markets. And to put sort of conceptualize that a bit, is the developed market is essentially Europe, US, and Japan, and Australia and New Zealand. Emerging markets ranges from Saudi Arabia to China to Poland, Korea, Colombia, and a lot others. And as you hear when I'm mentioning those countries, you have very different countries there. Saudi Arabia is very wealthy, with a lot of oil assets. Poland is part of EU and also quite rich. South Korea is highly technological and very, very developed country. And then you're grouping them in with countries that are middle income countries that maybe have a more manufacturing base, or a country like India or China, which is also very different in terms of political factors. And doing that sort of labeling in such a broad terms, I don't think is helpful at all, because it means that when you're sitting at the top of the food pyramid in an asset manager and you're deciding, should we allocate money to government bonds or to equity or to emerging market bonds, you look at emerging markets and you say, that's allocated over there. And in reality, what happens is that because you allocate it to emerging markets, but that tends to then be South Korea, Poland, and China. And actually not emerging in what we would think of, but rather actually quite well-off countries. So I think
we need to be more nuanced in terms of, and we need to be more sort of sensitive, if you like, when it comes to our categorization of different economies and different opportunities. Is that a fair synopsis?
Yeah, exactly. And instead of sort of categorizing them into 3 buckets, I think we just need to say that let's judge each on its own. Let's go government bonds, and then we can dial up and down the risk depending on where we want to be. But we don't do it on a label. We do it on GDP growth or labor statistics or whatever else economic indicator you want to pick out of the box. But the label, I don't think, is helping anyone. It feels like a very dated way of doing it.
I was going to say, it feels wild to me that we live in such a data-driven, complex, sort of detailed, granular world. And yet the way that you've just described the throwing in of those, as you say, very different countries with very different financial contexts into a single category, that just seems insane. And what you've described seems like a very simple sort of, I know it's not the full solution, but sort of first step. Is that sort of suggestion, is that sort of thing beginning to sort of be integrated, or is that something that's been resisted against?
I never heard anyone talk about it, to be honest. It's completely ingrained into the system. So it's the way you measure performance for individual asset managers. So when you're looking at your return, you want to see, okay, how is my portfolio returning compared to an average of the industry? And that average tends to be based on those labels, because you need to do a relevant comparison. But that also means that as an investor, I'm not going to deviate too much from that average, because then I risk too much. So we're essentially giving the power to decide these things to the ones that develop these benchmarks, as they're called, and it's essentially a duopoly between 2 companies.
And what that then means in the coming back to this real world application is that the finance that is available is not getting to a lot of those developing countries, I know we hate using the terminology, but we're just using it for the sake of clarity. It's not getting to those that really need it and perhaps have the opportunity to be a really good investment opportunity because they're being sort of, overlooked on the basis of the other developing nation opportunities that are sort of more commonplace. Is that the impact of this?
Yeah, and to put that sort of in perspective is that like if we think of what's called a multi-asset portfolio, so this is sort of like when you invest for your pension, you tend to get a little bit of everything in your portfolio because you want to have the broadest risk diversification as possible. In a portfolio like that, you would normally have mortgages and bonds and government debt from developed markets represent somewhere between 20 and 40%. From emerging markets, it's between 1 and 10%. And then if we're thinking, okay, but how does that, like how big is emerging markets compared to developed markets? So about 85% of the population lives in emerging markets and about 40% of GDP is in emerging markets. So if you're looking even just at GDP, we're underweighting it somewhere between 40 and 4 times. So it is very, very ingrained into our system in that like these countries are too risky because they have this label on them, rather than looking at like the individual country and being like, actually, this country is doing phenomenal and they're doing all the right thing and they're growing and everyone is employed and there's no corruption or whatever it is. We just sort of look at the label and decide that it's too risky.
It's absolutely wild, Cédric. It is wild to hear this. I great purport to be, I think I'm one of those people now speaking to excellent people like yourself who's probably developed a dangerous level of understanding and appreciation of how the financial systems work. But this is it's just shocking. It's just absolutely shocking that we live in such a non-sensitive way of operating. How does it, I mean, when you look at things, I know that the justification is risk, but essentially the system is set up to maintain the status quo and perhaps even exacerbate the status quo to an even greater extent. There's obviously the whole colonialization, if you like. And I think then the article talks about the decolonializing of international development. Without the sorts of changes that you're describing here, we've got no chance. Is that a fair observation?
Yeah, and I think actually like one of the things that worries me looking forward is as we're doing a transition on the climate side, so from our fossil fuels to our green energies, one of the characteristics we know there is that green energies are very capital intensive, but then they don't cost much to run. So if we're thinking about a solar panel, you need to buy it and then it runs for itself. You have no cost once you've installed it. And fossil fuels are the opposite, right? So it doesn't cost that much to build a natural gas power plant, but then you have to pay for the gas as you go on. And that challenge is that, well, now we're making the capital expensive for emerging markets. And what you actually need to transition in a climate sense is capital. You don't need cheap labor. You don't need low cost of running things because there is no cost of running it, or very low at least. So it becomes, if we want to help countries to transition across the world and not just in Europe, we need to also address the sort of elephant in the room in that the solar panel is not profitable at a 15% interest rate on your loan. You need to have a lower rent rate on your loan, because even if you're in the sunniest country in the world, it's not profitable because you're paying it all in interest costs. And that becomes a very, very scary thing if we're looking forward to a greener world, because it means that we are once again taking all the technology to Europe and to US, and we're keeping it here.
Cédric, I'm in danger of getting infuriated by the state of play, and I think I'm always keen to try and, I guess, finish the conversation before we talk magic wands. Although I'm fascinated to hear what you're going to do with the magic wand. Always try to finish it on a positive or more optimistic look at things. How we've obviously touched upon a significant change that could have a really big impact, and you've perfectly described that. How hopeful are you that we are going to see the kind of changes to the systems that are required in order to address things like the climate situation, but equally other kind of forms of inequality, if you like, across the world?
Yeah, I think one thing that is actually maybe the flip side of what I just said is that we're also seeing the cost of a lot of the green technologies just completely plummeting, where it becomes very, very, very cheap. And one of the arguments that you often hear for the risk to have a high interest rate, and the argument to sort of saying that it's risky, is that these countries are dependent on buying energy and fossil fuels, which means they have to, I've become a little bit technical now, but it means they need to sell their own currency to buy US dollars to buy the oil, because oil is priced in US dollars.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a risk to their currency, which will devaluate. And I am quite hopeful that by being more energy secure and having in domestic energy, we're going to see less of that. And it's going to and we've seen that coming through in a myriad of places. So South Africa has had a record uptake of solar panels, and it's primarily due to a lot of blackouts, where previously you owned your own diesel generator because you expect the blackouts, and now you realize that it's actually cheaper to buy solar panels and batteries. And what that means is you don't need to buy the diesel.
And this is the shift. Is it shift loading? Is that right? Is that how they describe it in South Africa?
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It's fascinating. So, and just the consequences of that, Cédric, are, and again, I might be overstretching my ability to understand this, but the impact of that is that then ensures that the local currency remains strong, because it isn't having to devalue itself by investing in the US dollars required in order to buy fossil fuels or oil. And as a result of that, if we then implement a more granular way of analyzing emerging market opportunities, then we might find a situation in which countries like South Africa, etc., are seen as more attractive and less risky to invest in.
Exactly. That's perfectly summarized.
Right. Okay. Brilliant. Well, Cédric, I love it. We've finished on a real positive there. Let's move on to the magic wand question to conclude. Cédric, if I was to hand you a magic wand, this ever increasingly used magic wand, your episode 106, I should say, Cédric. So yeah, it's been used a fair few times. If I was to hand you a magic wand and you could change one thing about the commercial world this instant, what would that one thing be?
I think I would make all the large public investors, so these would be your wealth funds, your charity organizations, your pension funds, and so on, that are owned by the public. So you and I own them, in essence, to make them invest in emerging markets according to the same weight as GDP. Mm-hmm. So all of a sudden, 40% of their portfolio should be in emerging markets. So that would be about a quadrupling of investments with a magic wand. And I think that would have severe consequences in a positive way, very, very drastic consequences in lowering the cost of capital and shifting capital to emerging markets.
And Cédric, and I love how I was hoping that you were going to magic wand with that, because that has been, I think, the most sort of is the most sort of jaw-dropping and most interesting element of this conversation, certainly for me. Out of interest, and without trying to get back onto a negative to conclude with, but what, besides the sort of traditional, as you said, way that one would analyze one fund's success over another, etc., what's stopping us from getting to that point?
I think there's some infrastructure plumbing that needs to sort of come in place. Mm-hmm. Because if we couldn't do it overnight, because there just isn't enough investment in emerging markets, because it's something that needs to grow, right? So no one is taking up mortgages in certain countries. You don't take a mortgage because it's better to just buy it cash because the interest rate is too high. So you need to start creating products that are mortgage products and teach the bank to do it and teach the public to actually that this is a thing you can get, and so on. So there is, and then that needs to sort of flow upstream to the end investor. So there is some plumbing that needs to come in place, but that would sort of naturally fall in place if we start increasing the capital going there. Like I'm not too worried about that. If there's one thing I trust the finance sector to do, it's to want to earn money. And this is this is a golden opportunity for them to do it. So I wouldn't doubt that they'll figure that one out.
Fantastic. Well, good to finish on a pragmatic but optimistic note. Cédric, thank you so much. This has been a brilliant conversation. I've learned a great deal. I am going to take my slightly unnerved and upset view of things, and very much hope to see the changes that you described come into force. Thank you for joining us. It's been great.
Thank you so much, Ollie, for having me.
And that's it for today's episode of The Responsible Edge. A big thank you to Cédric Olivares-Jirsell, Director of Sustainable Data at Matter, for joining us and sharing his insights on global inequality and sustainable development. Today, we explored key takeaways from the Guardian article, The Rich Benefit More Than the Poor, Development's Paradox, discussing how financial systems, trade imbalances, and climate finance continue to disadvantage the global south, and what it needs to change to create a fairer, more sustainable global economy. This episode was brought to you by the Anti-Greenwash Charter, championing responsible sustainability communications. Visit antigreenwashcharter.com to learn more. I'm Charlie Martin. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. See you next time.